In 2010, while on a military training exercise, members of a four-man reconnaissance team were stalked by an over 9 foot tall dogman. But before we get into their encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And if you have a story that you would like to share on the show, please email me at the link below. And since I'll be uploading multiple times every week, before you go fast roping out of a chopper, grab that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This encounter comes from Adam, and it happened in 2010 out in the mountains of Squamish, British Columbia. Adam had been a 10-year Canadian Forces member at this point, and he specialized in reconnaissance. What reconnaissance is basically going out and gathering information on enemy locations, enemy strength, enemy equipment, taking all that information and passing it up the chain of command so that the higher-ups can make decisions on how they're going to complete their objectives based on how many troops they're going to need or what type of equipment they're going to need based on that intel. It's a very integral part of any operation. And Adam belonged to a four-man recce team that specialized in doing exactly this. And in 2010, him and his team were sent out to the Canadian Forces Land Advanced Warfare Center, which is located out of Squamish, BC. This is where the Canadian Forces go to train in high-altitude training as well as mountain warfare training. And the objectives for Adam and his team on this training exercise were to go to various locations set up throughout the mountains, do recon of each one of those objectives, gather as much intel as possible and pass it up the chain of command, and then his team was going to be scored based on the intel that they provided. Prior to the exercise kicking off, him and his team attended their safety brief and the mission briefing. Once that was over, they drew their weapons, gathered their gear, and then they made their way to a CH-146 Griffin. Once they were in the chopper took off and started flying into the mountains. Once they arrived where the chopper was going to drop them off, him and his team roped out of the chopper. As soon as they hit the ground, they pulled a 360-degree security, and as soon as the chopper took off the rest of the way, the team got up and they made their way into the bush line. Once in the bush line, Adam had two of his guys pull security while him and another one of his soldiers reviewed the map, trying to kind of figure out where they were and set a bearing for where their first objective was. Once they had determined exactly where they were and where their first objective was, the team got up and they started moving through the mountains and through the woods. They walked for several hours through the dense woods of the mountains of British Columbia, and at one point they came to a valley. When they got to the valley, they made their way down the valley, and at the bottom there was a small river. They crossed that river and they started making their way up the opposing slope of the opposing mountain. Shortly after going up the other side of that mountain, they reached this plateau that overlooked that valley, and from there they could see their objective. It was nothing more than just a couple sections of mod tent with a couple of guys walking around it, and at that point Adam made the call that his team was just going to perform the recce from that plateau. It was full on daylight and he did not want to risk getting seen getting any closer. Plus, from that position, they had a perfect field of view of that entire area. They could see exactly what was going on. So him and his team spent several hours just lying on this plateau, looking down at this position, taking notes of troop movements and weapons, just gathering all the intel that they were going to need for that first objective. His team spent several hours just watching this position, taking notes, and then at dark it became time for them to move to the next objective. Their next objective was located about 1.5 miles away from where they currently were, and before the team got up and just kind of blindly made their way into the woods, they put on their night vision goggles just so that they could see any enemy activity a little bit easier. They could be able to see any hazards in front of them. They wouldn't have to worry about just blindly walking off a cliff because they didn't see it. If you don't know how night vision goggles work, they work on a principle called optoelectric image enhancement. Basically, these units will emit a very small amount of infrared light. That light will bounce back off of objects, and then the unit will electronically enhance it and produce the image as like a green glow. They're really great for being able to see things in the dark, but it does reduce your depth perception. Speaking from experience, the NSV-7s that I had used when I was in the military were an absolute nightmare to try to drive in when we were doing blackout drives. But once this team had their NVGs on, they started making their way through the woods to their next objective. Once they arrived just outside where their next objective was, Adam left two men behind as a security element, and then him and his fire team partner started making their way towards the objective. Once they were about halfway to it, they split off. Adam went up the left flank, and his fire team partner went up the right. Basically, what they were going to be doing was kind of clover leafing around the objective, getting different views from different positions of the objective so they could gather as much intel as possible. Shortly after branching off from his partner, Adam was going through a really thick chunk of bush, and as he was making his way through the trees, he started to feel like he was being watched. Now, he had been doing this job for quite a while, so he learned to really trust his gut, and because there was an active enemy force in the area for this exercise, his first thought was that somebody from that enemy force had seen him or there was a patrol in the area. So he followed his training, he ducked down behind a tree, went completely silent, and he was just kind of scanning the area, trying to see if there was an enemy force troop coming up on his position. He lied there for several minutes just watching through the woods. He didn't see anything, so he radioed up to his overwatch asking if they could see anything from where they were. They replied back that they could not see anything, so he waited a few more minutes, that he got up and continued to kind of make his way towards the objective. Now, though, he was a little bit more on edge, so he had his weapon up at the high ready, and he was making his way through the trees. He ended up coming to a small clearing, so when he got to the edge of the clearing, he took a knee, kind of scanned across the clearing, making sure there was no enemy force in front of him. Then he got up and he started making his way across this clearing. When he was about 3/4 of the way across the clearing, his buddies that he had left up on security radioed down to him that they had movement coming up his 6. That means coming up from behind at the 6 o'clock, which is directly behind you. So as soon as he heard that come over his radio, he bounded the rest of the way across this clearing into the wood line, hit the ground, and then he got his weapon up and he started looking back across this field, waiting to intercept or see whoever that was coming up behind him. So he just lied there for a few minutes, just kind of scanning the area, trying to see if anybody was going to come moving out of those bushes, and he didn't see anybody. So he radioed up to the security element. The security element came back over the radio with that they didn't see anybody either. So he was just going to lie there for a few more minutes, and he was going to get up and move to his next position. As he was lying there looking across that clearing, all of a sudden he caught a glimpse of something really large through his NVGs moving through those woods. He knew instantly that this was not a person, because there was no way a person can be that tall. He had a couple really tall guys in his unit, but nothing compared to what he was looking at. So he just lied there completely motionless, staring across this clearing at this figure moving through the trees. This figure made its way to the edge of the bush line, and then it started making its way across the clearing directly towards Adam. Once it started to get a little bit closer, he was able to start making out details of this thing in front of him. And what he described as walking towards him was a 9.5-foot tall bipedal creature. It had the head of a dog, back legs bent backwards like a dog. It had a tail. It was absolutely muscular. He said on its hands, it looked like it had 4 to 5 inch nails or claws sticking off the ends of its fingers. And his first thought when he saw this was werewolf. This thing was about 60 yards away from him. It stopped, it bent down, and it started smelling the ground. Now, where Adam was, he had the wind blowing directly in his face, so his scent was not being blown back towards this thing. But Adam was lying there, and he did not know what to do. He had his C7A2, and he had his Browning 1911. However, he only had blank rounds because this was just an exercise. The only thing he had on him was a paraflare. So he was just lying there watching this thing, sniffing the ground. All of a sudden, it lifted its head, and it looked right at him. And through his NVGs, he said its eyes glowed more than the whole rest of its body. He said when he saw that, he freaked out. He reached inside his tack vest, grabbed the paraflare, and he fired it up into the air. Now, a paraflare will fly up in the air, ignite, and it'll light up an entire area pretty good in the dark. So when he shot this thing up, as soon as it started to illuminate that area, he said that this thing let out an absolute guttural growl. As soon as it growled, it turned and it just started running across the clearing back into that opposing bush line. Almost instantly, over the radio, he could hear his security element asking him what that thing was, because they had seen this thing come out of the bush and start going across the clearing as well, but they did not want to radio Adam and risk alerting this creature to where he was. So Adam quickly got up and he started making his way towards that enemy position, not to continue on with the reconnaissance, but to just get away from what he had just seen. Plus, because their training objectives were to not be seen and not be captured by the enemy. So, because he launched that paraflare, they had failed their training mission. So, at this point, he didn't even care about getting spotted because they had already failed. So, once he got to the enemy position, the rest of his team joined up and then they got called back to base. Once they were back at base, they had a lot of questions that they needed to answer, like why he gave away their position with this paraflare. And he ended up telling his command that he launched the paraflare because of a grizzly. He said that there was an aggressive grizzly in front of him. It wasn't leaving, so he fired the paraflare just as a form of self-defense. Adam and his team never officially reported this dogman to the chain of command just because they did not want to face the ridicule that would come with that. Adam's advice is if you're going out in the woods, he said, always trust your gut. He said, your gut is your best defense. He said, if something seems off, trust your gut and get out. But he also said, make sure you have another form of protection aside from just your gut. He said, carry something on you that you could use to defend yourself. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us. And if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. And if you haven't done so already, before you go fast roping out of a chopper, grab that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.